much, Tim. I'm going to try and do this, I work at the University of Reading and I'm a lecturer there, and I have a tendency to walk around and make a lot of movements, so apologize in advance for that. But I kind of thought at this point in the program for today you might be feeling a bit restless. And so I thought it would be good if we just kind of started by getting a perspective of who is actually in the audience here. So how about if you help me out with that, and I'll have you stand up, for example, when I call some of these characteristics. And I just think it's very helpful to see who is all in the audience. So stand up if you have a family member who is on the autistic spectrum disorder. Thank you. So we've got about a third of the audience here today. Thank you. Stand up if you're a professional and you have an interest in this particular topic, please. And it's fine to stand up more than once as well. Thank you very much. Stand up if you're an individual affected by some of the issues we're talking about today. Thank you, Roz. And stand up if you've come across this in your personal or work life. And I'm talking about issues affected by the debate about sexuality for individuals. And that group is probably the largest group that I've had stand up today. And thank you very much. And I think it actually says a lot about this particular topic in general. And I think it's actually quite important, the importance of this topic and how it touches a lot of people's lives. And yet it's probably one of the topics that there's the fewest amount of research about. And it's one of those topics people just don't want to talk about, or they feel embarrassed about talking about. And so therefore it's something, of course, I'm interested in since nobody else is interested in it. So let's start here. And I think this is quite an odd place to start, but it actually helps put this whole idea in perspective. And I really, this is something that recently struck me, is this shifting definition about what we are and who we are and what society thinks about people with learning difficulties, disabilities, and with autism in general. So we started with this idea of integration, and the big issue at that point was putting everybody into mainstream type settings, integrating. It's about putting and placing people all together. And that seemed to have gone off focus, and we started thinking about, well, that's not really the whole story. That's not the whole picture. It's really much more about inclusion. So it's not only about being in that place, it's actually about being part of that place and actually having the same experiences and the same opportunities that everyone has. Well, now the focus seems to have recently shifted again. And this is something that's actually quite new, and it's this focus on this issue of social justice. And that's really taken a much of a clear focus, and especially with this new equalities duty. And it's not just about people with disabilities anymore, but it's about all types of difference and all types of unique aspects of individuals. And I really think that now the focus seems to be coming on to this idea of rights and the fact that society is actually starting to come to grips with the fact that all individuals have rights and all individuals have a right of an experience. And that's just, and that is socially just, okay? Well, we can all say that till the cows come home, and we can all believe that that issue is right and social justice. And then we actually start to look at that in practice and start applying that right to the actual practice that we see in the field, in the schools, and in society. And it's an uneasy balance. And sometimes it's clear, and sometimes it's less clear. And let me give you an example of this so that I can kind of make it a little bit more understandable. if we think about access, it was a big movement in the past. People with wheelchairs or mobilities needed a right to access. And so we saw a lot of change in society. For example, curbs were cut out so people with wheelchairs could have access. Ramps were installed. Buses actually had platforms that were movable so people could have access. And I think everybody in general would agree that that was a good movement and that was a good thing, except possibly the person who was in a hurry or in a rush and didn't want to wait for the ramps to be moved on the bus, etc. But that's not something that's clear-cut and obvious across all topics. And sexual identity is one of these things that fits into this uneasy tension in here. And then I think everybody would agree on a theoretical basis, it's a good idea. Everyone has an individual. It's socially just that we all have that aspect of our personality, or else make a conscious choice not to exercise that, but it's us being in control, us having the right to make those decisions. But that balance, in theory, doesn't actually correlate to practice on an individual level. That's where it starts to get messy. That's where it starts to actually have reality with it. And I think that's why this slide is actually quite appropriate for this topic, is that we can think in theory one thing, but the practice is oftentimes different. And what's actually interesting in particular is that we're not all at the same place when we talk about this uneasy balance. There may be some of us who are very strong believers and have very strong views on the rights of individuals. But yet there may be others who just cannot actually process that right now and really don't have those strong beliefs. And that's where the tension comes in, and that's where the uneasy balance is. And especially if there are views that are differing in an institution or differing between, for example, parents and that institution. And that's what this is here to really focus on. Those views do overlap, and there are times when we share common views, but there are often times where we don't have views in similar. And I think it's really important to actually go back to that theoretical understanding and find those common views that we share. Because to say no to a sexual identity or an expression of it is just brushing the idea under the carpet. It's not going to go away. And often in my experience in working with young people, as well as what I do now mainly is working with Senkos and students and teachers, is it gets an awful lot worse if we don't address it in a timely manner. And just because it's uncomfortable, it doesn't go away, and we can't ignore it. But I do think that there is value in the debate. It helps us focus our perspective. It helps us come to that common, agreed, shared beliefs, and it helps us find a way forward. So I'm not advocating we all agree the same thing, but I am advocating that we all find a way to come to a common belief about this topic, and so that we can actually move forward. Okay? So individuals with characteristics of autism-related conditions do not necessarily prefer aloneness, as one's assumed, but rather experience increased levels of loneliness related to the lack of social skills and understanding. So it's not as if it's a one-size-fits-all. There are individuals who choose to be alone, and there are times in all of our lives when we choose to be alone. But it isn't an assumption that it's that way for everyone. And what my point is in this quote here by Job and White is that what we need to do is help individuals determine where that line is for themselves. So we need to allow them, just as Roz was saying this morning, to have that opportunity to be alone when that's right for them, but also we need to give them the skills that they need to get that social experience that they also do want and crave. If you talk to young men with Asperger's syndrome, they're absolutely desperate for girlfriends, okay? And they just don't understand why girls don't want to sit and listen to talk about double glazing all day long, okay? And so what we need to do is actually bridge that gap a bit and find it. And this is really important because, you know, the government is directing us towards that common understanding. The government is directing us towards listening to the others, and especially with the Lamb report, and the value of the input from parents is really important right now. So there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of influencing factors that we look at when we talk about autism. Okay? The first bits of here are really straightforward. Other speakers have spoken about this today. But there is something I want to go forward a little bit when we talk about communication. This is something that I got in Tony Atwood's book. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's quite a helpful exercise. I've got a sentence on here. I didn't say she took my money. And what I'd like you to do is read it with me. And each time we read it together, I want you to put the emphasis on a different word. So I'll do the first one so you get an understanding of what I mean. I didn't say she took my money. Now, what do I mean by that? Somebody else did. This time, do it with me, and we'll put the emphasis on didn't. Ready? I didn't say she took my money, but perhaps I implied it, okay? Ready? I didn't say she took my money. I hinted at it, okay? Next one. I didn't say she took my money. Maybe it was somebody else. The next one. I didn't say she took my money, but perhaps she borrowed it. Next one. I didn't say she took my money, but perhaps she took someone else's. And the last one. I didn't say she took my money, but possibly she took something else, okay? So I think this is really helpful when we talk about the issues relating to communication, because the words on there are exactly the same. And it's only for us putting an intonation in a different place that actually changes the meaning quite significantly. And when we talk about this issue of communication and relating to individuals with autism, and especially relating to this particular area, it's so involved with the hidden meanings that are in words, etc. I'll give you another example, and I use this with my students and the ladies. You're at the pub, and there's a chap sitting next to you, and he says to you, "Can I buy you a drink?" And you say to this chap, "Just a minute, I'm going to nip to the loo, and I'll come right back." Okay? I know this may be surprising for the gents in the audience here, but ladies, what do you really mean by that? Are you coming back? No, okay? But if you were, I know that may be surprising. But if you're a young man with Asperger's syndrome or autism, you have heard the literal meaning of that. You've heard that she's coming back, and you'll sit and wait. And when we talk about these issues relating to sexuality, there are so many of those that it's just a minefield to try and get through and have that understanding. And it's so much a core aspect of autism that it's really quite complicated, and it's quite complex. But there are other things that actually influence these areas when we're talking about. And the other one is actually the attitudes of society. At one time, historically, individuals with disabilities were thought to be put away in those homes or hospitals, and it was thought to be improper that they would have any kind of sexual identity, let alone have any kind of intimacy or relationships, whether that's on a personal level with themselves or whether it is with others. And there were some influences, for example, from the religious sector that just did not believe or allow those kind of exercises to happen. Sometimes the catch-all phrase for those of us in the professional side of things is, it's illegal. We don't know the legal requirements. And that is really something that I would counter with, that it is the responsibility of the school or of the institution or of the home to actually be familiar with them. That's not an excuse, okay? It's not fair on individuals if you are not doing your job and by keeping up to date with what your responsibilities are. But the next one down there is being uncomfortable with the nature of the topic. I think that's a given. I think we have to accept that fact. Those of you who are parents in the audience here, when you first get to that point where your child, your son, your daughter, and you're aware that they do have a close personal relationship, that's a very hard thing to actually recognize. And when that moves on to becoming a sexual relationship, that's even harder. You don't like the fact that your children are growing up. And when you actually say that to parents of young people with autism, it's not only got that fact that it's their child growing up, but it's also the fact that it's a closer awareness of how different their child is from other children in that same situation. It's another reminder that they may not grow up, move out of the home, get married, have grandchildren. Okay? The penultimate one up there is a fear of the accusation of a lack of adherence to the child protection responsibilities. Child protection is a fine line here. And it's something that we all need to be very clear on, and the way to get around that is communication, so that everybody is aware of what it is. Again, it's not an excuse because we're afraid of the child protection legislation, which is there for a very good reason. And then the final point on here is the personal views. And that individuals have their own belief systems, and they may have very closely held beliefs, whether that's of a religious nature, whether that's of a social nature, or of a personal nature. And that's absolutely fine. But there needs to be a recognition that that is a personal view and perhaps not a public view or a view of the school that the individual works for. But it's not all clear. There are some risks. And these risks actually come from not giving individuals the proper education when it comes down to it. And I think it's one of those tensions where there's a fear factor of the risks. And the fear is that if I don't support my young person into having a better awareness of their sexual identity, well, I'm protecting them in a way. I'm protecting them from a risk of being abused, or actually the opposite of that, which is something we need to face, which is inflicting abuse as well. And I guess I have a little story on that, because when I was at university, I had a girlfriend, and she had a boyfriend, and I put that in quotes, because he used to beat her regularly. Came to the house one night, in the middle of the night, she was all bloody, and I called the women's abuse helpline. I said, help me, what am I supposed to do now that my girlfriend is like this? And the woman on the other end of the phone said, support her because she'll go back to him. And I said, no, there's no way. This is a college-educated, a young woman, very independent, had it together. There's no way she's going to go back to him. But she did, and she actually married him. And she's divorced him since then. But my point is that we need to, in a way, make sure that we're aware that there are risks for everyone in society. And we need to sometimes have an understanding of the choice element in taking risks. It would be lovely if we could protect everyone in the same way that we pretend to protect our individuals with disabilities. But I'm not really sure that that's possible in this type of culture or this type of evidence. But I do feel that we have to have the knowledge base for people to be involved in the choice making and the decision makings that they have. And that actually does bring with it an element of risk. But that risk element is much greater without that knowledge. It's not less. We do also risk sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancies, and that comes from a lack of knowledge, okay? A lack of being prepared. And that is a risk of a lack of knowledge of a sexual identity. And poor sexual health for individuals who are sexually active and don't have a lot of knowledge about personal care or health and hygiene and regular checkups. But I think for me and for the group of young people that I've worked with most recently is that last bullet point on there is probably the one that I'm most concerned about, which is not often the first thing people think about. If we have a young person who is very motivated by the stimulation and the pleasure they feel when they're masturbating, and they have no awareness socially of where they do it or when they do it, that's not a person that we can bring out into public. That's not a person that you can take to the Tesco store on a Saturday morning, is it? And I feel then there is a real risk of a lack of a quality of life if we haven't given the young person these skills to be able to manage those urges in an appropriate way. And I feel that that is something that is a real risk, often, more times than not, and that we're oftentimes lack of understanding about that. And I really think that this is just not an easy topic to talk about. And oftentimes it leads to this, this lovely station there, this prison of protection. And that what we're doing is we're keeping people in this safe environment, and we're not allowing them, we're not stretching them as Roz was advocating this morning. We're not challenging them. We're not having these high expectations. We're not giving them the tools they need to be as independent as we want them. We really do want them to be. This prison of protection is not really helping them. It's a prison. So, just to put this in context, I think this is all really straightforward. Children change. They grow and mature, and that process happens no matter what the abilities of the individual are. And with that physical change, there are also changes that happen in society, and society expects things from them. If a child is having a wobbly in the store and that because they want a sweet, and that child is 2 years old, that's a little bit more understandable for the nice old lady that is there next to them. If that child is a young person with autism who's 15 and having a wobbly on the street and on the aisle in the Tesco store because they want something, society doesn't accept that, okay? So when people mature and change, society has different expectations for them as well. So, overall, adolescents with disabilities seem to be participating in sexual relationships without adequate knowledge and the skills to keep them happy, healthy, safe, and satisfied. So what we mean by all of that is that it's happening, and we haven't actually given them the tools to do that for all of the reasons that we've previously stated. And this is something I've just mentioned previously, is that it's a hard one for families. It is. And particularly for parents, they're very sensitive about this issue. It's a reminder of the differences between their child and peers, It brings about that looming issue of the future and what's going to happen. And this is something that is very uncomfortable. But oftentimes the activity and the nature of the autism means that the child is enjoying that stimulation and does not care where they get the stimulation from. And that can often be inappropriately directed to a family member. Okay? And that's very difficult for families to understand and to actually deal with. And perhaps most importantly is this debate over who's responsible for teaching the topic. Sex ed is part of the national curriculum in this country, and it's a required part that we need to teach. And yet, when we talk about some of the actual practical aspects of this for individuals, the personal nature of it makes it very difficult to come to terms with. And everybody would prefer, well, we all agree it needs to be done, but we'd prefer somebody else to have to do it, okay? And I think it's important to actually say that we need to start. We need to start by recognizing that this is an issue. We need to start when they're young before it becomes a big issue. And we actually need to start with an assessment that looks at the individual and to see where the training is needed and how we can all work together to do that. And by all working together, I mean staff and families, as well as the Child Protection Services and some of the other agencies. Again, if we're communicating with each other, I think that's the best place to start. Okay? So, sexual identity. This is how I've defined it. So now we've gotten to the point where we agree that it needs to be done, people need to be taught about it. It's an individual person's view of how they see their sexual self and how that person expresses that aspect to themselves as well as to others. And for some people, it can be a very personal issue. And for some individuals, it may be a solo act. For other individuals, it may not be. It may be a mutual act between two individuals that are consenting. But for everyone, it's different, and it's expressed individually with members of the same or opposite sex. Now, particularly with young people with autism, we all know it's a greater prevalence with males than females. And I don't think it's rocket science to think that there's going to be more males together than opportunities with members of the opposite sex. And so we do have, although I've never read any research on it, and I'm looking at Tim, have you seen any research on homosexuality in this population? I haven't seen any, but my guess is that it may be, but I don't know if that's a conscious choice or a lack of options, or a friendship that's developed. But my point is, for everyone, it's different, and it's a natural, normal, healthy thing to happen. So, where do we go from here? Got somebody in mind? You've actually, now everyone has decided we need to actually look at this person and to see how we can help support them in discovering their sexual identity. Well, the first thing is a greater awareness of what this involves, and communication is the key here. I think we need to have a meeting of the minds where there are a variety of creative ideas and beliefs shared in an open forum. The next step is an assessment of the ability to consent. Now, this is where I drift off a bit from the academic literature, because not only am I a lecturer at the University of Reading, but I'm also a parent of a young man who's quite affected by his autism. And I actually think that these tests they have to consent are not really in an individual's, I think they're more on the theoretical than on the practical side. And I wish they would have a more personalized view, because I strongly believe that my son should have the right to have a sexual identity with somebody who else is consenting. Unfortunately, the law says otherwise. But anyway, that's my personal view on this topic. But I do feel that there needs to be some kind of formalized process where people are agreeing on this ability of an individual's right to consent. And I also believe quite strongly that the regulatory agencies, I know they're bureaucratic, and I know that it's often difficult to get a hold of anybody who can make any decisions. But I do feel that we need to involve them where and when it's appropriate. And it's only by having an open communication can we avoid some of the risks that we spoke about earlier. And then I believe that there needs to be a regular process of review to establish some independent checks and balances, and then a plan can be drawn up. Now, it's at that point I just want to share with you briefly that I brought some materials with. This is something that I've been working with some colleagues at St. Crispin's School. Because one of the problems we always have with this topic in coming up with a teaching plan is that the materials don't exist. They're either very high above the levels of the individuals that we're working with, or the actual presentation of them is difficult for our young people with autism to access. So the solution is to create your own. And this is something that, and I just brought it with me so you could see it, but they've done it and they've created a series of worksheets and teaching plans and things like that to be able to work on an individual basis with young people. And it covers everything from personal hygiene to relationships to where it's, what kind of people it's appropriate to touch you. You know, how do you explain the aspect of a doctor who's doing a feminine check on a young person with autism? That actually is a stranger, if you think about it technically, okay? And so there are a lot of different little nuances and things that need to be thought through, and something like a curriculum is really quite helpful. In addition to that, there's a couple of already made things, and that's one of the other problems that come with. So if you decide you want to have a teaching plan and you decide you want to create some materials, have you ever tried to search on the internet for pictures of genitalia? Dare I say it, I'm sure that there are banned blocks on the internet, or, you know, can you imagine that, explaining that to the police, you know? So there are some materials that are in existence that actually do go through a lot of things, and this is actually one that is quite good because I don't know if I printed off the pictures, but the pictures are actually quite simple without a lot of background material and without a lot of background words. And they actually get, dare I say it, quite explicit. I won't show you the real good ones, but you can come up afterwards if you'd want. Pardon? Do you want to see it? You can come up here later on and see it. And then finally, we have to get to the point where we actually do create. And I know it may mean a simple matter of asking who's artistic amongst the staff and then telling them afterwards what you want them to draw. But it can be done. And I don't want to offend anybody, but this one here in particular is quite detailed in a very personalized way. So you can come up and take a look at them a little bit later. Okay. don't think it would be appropriate for me to have any talk about a sexual identity without talking about self-pleasuring or masturbation. I remember I had to give a talk at a big conference in San Diego, the AERA, the American Educational Research Association, a large audience. And my boss said to me, and I was new at that time, he said, "Oh, Cathy, you got a paper accepted at AERA. Wow, great, I'll come and listen to your paper." And I said, "You know what, Andy, I'm going to be talking about masturbation, and I'd prefer if you weren't really in the audience." But I think we need to be realistic, and we have some constraints on us. We have protection agencies that may say we're not sure if these two individuals are consenting. And for a lot of the people, especially the young people at the school, this is probably going to be one of the few activities in their sexual identity that they will actually be able to have access to. And it's one of the most common types amongst not only the learning disabled young people, but also adolescents, let's be honest. And it can lead to a lot of problems, especially if a young person knows that this stimulation feels good, but they're not able to do it appropriately, or do it too much, or injure themselves, or do it at inappropriate times. That's a big problem in schools. And that often leads to difficulties due to frustration or challenging behaviors. Or, you know, if you have a young person who's very determined that this is what they're going to do, if you try and redirect that, they can get quite aggressive. And my point is that these issues aren't going to go away, and that they'll only escalate with a lack of an educationally based strategy that all interesting parties contribute to. Because it doesn't do us any good to be doing one thing at school if at the home they're doing something differently, or if we're asking parents to do something and to be involved in this. Sometimes young people with autism associate a behavior with an individual. And can you imagine that if we actually put that burden onto parents? That's really quite difficult, and I would argue not necessarily. I think that may be a step too far. Okay? So how do we respond? All right. First thing we need to do is actually, and I think this is standard psychological processes, we actually need to figure out what it is we're targeting and define that actual behavior. And then we need to look at how staff respond. Is this consistent? And the reason why we want to do that is because of those reasons that Tim was pointing out earlier. Is this an escape mechanism? Does this only come up when it's time to do the maths curriculum? Does this only come up when it's time to go out into the community? And what we need to do is make sure that we're consistent. And does the behavior change in the different settings? Is the young person getting stimulated outside in the trees or in their bedroom alone? Are there any patterns which may help explain this activity? Let's be honest, we have some very young, very good-looking young women working with these adolescent males. I mean, it doesn't take a high degree of intelligence to figure out that it could be a particular member of staff that they are finding interesting. And is this a new behavior, or has this been going on for some time? I think it's really important to actually think about that last bit. Has this been going on for some time? Young people sometimes are very clever in how they stimulate themselves, and it can be part of a routine or part of a rocking motion or something like that. And so you need to really have an honest thought, an honest process of thinking. Is this really something that's new, or is this something that has actually been in existing for a while. And then to look a little further, is there one thing in particular or a cofactor, something that's happening? So for example, if you've got somebody who's incontinent, is that an activity that they could become more independent in to stop some types of stimulation? Is this attention seeking or other challenging behaviors? And finally, it's really quite important that we don't rule out abuse. I had a friend who was a police officer who used to swim with me and told me about a case where a young woman who used to love going to the day center all the time, and all of a sudden that stopped. And she became quite aggressive, and it just was an overnight thing. And it turns out she'd been sexually abused, and that was her way of telling everyone that something wasn't right. And it was only through staff actually starting to think, wow, this is a brand new behavior, we need to actually look at this, what's changed, that actually helped bring that person to justice. So teaching, it's required. We have to do it. There's no getting around it. We actually need to teach this topic. And there are some materials that do exist, and I shared the one from St. Crispin's School with you. But it's not easy. It is not easy. And we do have a lot of challenges with this topic in particular. The first one, I think, is information. There is not a lot of materials out there. And just in looking through the research literature, there aren't a lot of more recent studies that are on this particular topic. Consent is an issue. I feel we need to find a way through that. I feel it's really quite an important issue, and I feel to limit somebody to a solo activity when I do feel that there is a desire to have a relationship with somebody else, just because we can't figure out this issue of consent. I think that that's something we need to do. I'm sorry, I feel quite strongly about that. And I think what we need to do is find a way to have support, help a person develop their sexual identity, but do that in the least intrusive way possible. To support someone and then back out that support as they become more and more independent. And I feel very strongly that there is a role towards promoting independence, and this is a very strong aspect of that. So, just in conclusion, it's important for individuals to learn these skills if they are to be included in society. That's something, if there's one message that you get from this talk today, I'm hoping it's this. This is really something that doesn't go away. It is important for an individual to have a good quality of life, to actually have a good understanding of this and what it means for themselves. It certainly comes with challenges, and this is a very particular issue for families, but not exclusively for families. It's a challenge for us in society and staff, as well as the regulatory agencies as well. But it means that we need to engage with communication, and that we need to have all aspects of that circle around the individual involved. And that is true not only for services for children, but also for services as adults. One of the changes in this culture in the UK, that when your young person becomes 19, on that birthday, as a parent, you take a back step, and that they have an advocate now. And although I'm saying that that is good, it leads to independence for the young person, This particular issue, I feel it's quite strong that we all need to be working together, whether that's for a child or an adult. And finally, it's the responsibility of staff and families to actually address these needs. It doesn't go away. It only gets worse if we don't address them in a timely manner. And I think that's it. Oops, sorry. And just to say that the skills can be taught, and the real key to that is communication and planning. And then finally, I've just got some references there, and I put it out on a sheet of paper in case anybody's interested, because I know it's very hard to find research articles about this. But one of the things I would like to say is it's an area that I'm very interested in doing some more research in. And if there's anybody here, parents as well as professionals, who would be willing to do some interviews with me, I've left some little half sheets of paper. So either send me an email to the address there or fill in one of these sheets, and I would be very much appreciate anybody who wants to come forward and talk to me about this. Thank you. Right on time.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Cathy. We have time maybe for one or two quick questions before we move on to lunch.
You do that in the wrong order, Tim. You shouldn't say there's questions and then we can move to lunch.
Ah, sorry. I'm doing a first and then card. Sorry.
My question is, at one point you talked about a meeting of minds and sort of developing a plan. And I've got a young son who's not there yet, but will be, no doubt, in due course. Would you see that as something where the young person was very much involved in that plan if they were able to be so?
Absolutely.
Right.
But for some people, adolescence is very difficult. And to have an adolescent in the room with a lot of other people, it's very embarrassing to talk about something like this. So it may mean that they're able and can communicate their thoughts on a more private way than doing it in a public forum like that. But if they can be involved, then absolutely I would advocate that, yes.